beneath the glittering skyline of Chicago, where steel towers kissed the clouds and ambition pulsed through every avenue. Life for most people moved too fast to notice what lurked in the shadows. But on that particular night, fate decided to slow things down for two strangers whose lives couldn't have been more different. Alexander Grant had it allure, at least. That was what the world saw. The youngest CEO in his company's history. The man behind a billion-dollar real estate empire. His name was a brand synonymous with power, success, and charisma. Every magazine cover painted him as the epitome of modern ambition. Tall, broad-shouldered, with striking green eyes that never betrayed emotion, and a reputation for both brilliance and arrogance in equal measure. Women wanted him, men envied him, and the city itself seemed to bend to his will. Yet, beneath the polished exterior, Alexander carried a loneliness he never admitted aloud, buried beneath boardroom battles and cocktail parties that left him feeling empty long after the music faded. On the opposite end of the city's glittering spectrum was Isabella "Izzy" Carter. She had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, of living a simple but meaningful life. But dreams had a way of getting crushed when the world showed no mercy. 2 years ago, after losing her mother to illness and her job in the same month, Izzy had slipped through the cracks of society. Now, she drifted between shelters and quiet corners of the city, surviving on grit, wit, and the stubborn belief that life could still surprise her. And that night, it did. It was late, the streets slick from an earlier rain, the air thick with the mingled scents of gasoline and fried food from a vendor who was packing up for the night. Alexander exited a charity gala, his tuxedo immaculate despite the drizzle, his expression unreadable. He was walking toward his car parked on a dimly lit side street, a mistake he would later realize when 3 men emerged from the shadows, wallet, watch, and keys. The tallest one demanded, his voice low but firm. The glint of a knife caught the faint glow of a street lamp. Alexander froze, calculating. He wasn't the kind of man to panic easily, but he wasn't reckless either. He knew better than to fight back when the odds were 3 against 1, especially when one held a blade steady as a metronome. And then, out of nowhere, she appeared. "Hey." Izzy's voice rang sharp through the night as she stepped into view, a slender figure in a worn jacket and scuffed boots. She carried herself with the kind of defiance that came from surviving too many nights on the streets. The men turned toward her, momentarily thrown off by her sudden arrival. Alexander glanced at her, his expression flickering from confusion to disbelief. She didn't look like she had much to lose, and maybe that was exactly why she wasn't afraid. "You heard me," she said, her chin tilted upward. "Back off." The tallest man laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Or what, you gonna stop us?" Izzy didn't flinch. In one swift motion, she scooped up a broken bottle from the ground, its jagged edge catching the light. She didn't wave it wildly. She held it steady, like someone who had learned that hesitation could get you hurt. "Try me," she said simply. Something in her tone, or maybe the unpredictability of the situation, made the men hesitate. A tense silence stretched between them, the rain dripping from the edges of the awning overhead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tallest man cursed under his breath, motioned to the others, and they melted back into the darkness, their footsteps fading into the city's constant hum. Alexander exhaled slowly, his heartbeat pounding against his ribs. He turned to the woman who had just saved him, his mind racing with questions. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice low, rougher than intended. Izzy shrugged, lowering the bottle but keeping her eyes on him. "Didn't look like you had a plan," she said. For the first time in a long time, Alexander Grant didn't have a ready reply. He studied her, really studied her hand, realized she was shivering, rain soaking the edges of her jacket. She couldn't have been more than 25, with striking hazel eyes and dark hair pulled back into a messy knot. There was a sharpness to her, a pride that clung to her despite the threadbare clothes and the exhaustion etched into her face. "Let me at least drive you somewhere," he said finally, surprising himself. "It's the least I can do." She shook her head. "I'm fine," but he didn't believe that for a second, and something about her, the defiance, the mystery, the way she had stepped between him and danger without hesitation, stuck in his mind like a thorn he couldn't ignore. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything in his perfectly ordered life began to unravel. Alexander couldn't sleep that night. Back in his penthouse apartment, high above the restless city, he stood at the wall of glass windows with a tumbler of scotch in hand, watching headlights streak along the avenues below. His life had always been about control, controlling negotiations, controlling outcomes, controlling the image everyone saw when they looked at him. But a woman with nothing had thrown herself into danger for him, a man who had everything, and now she was lodged in his thoughts like a song he couldn't turn off. He should have let it go. People crossed paths in the city every day, only to disappear again into the anonymous current of millions. Yet he couldn't shake her face from his mind, the fierce set of her jaw, the way her eyes had dared 3 armed men to take a step closer. She hadn't even asked for anything. No name, no money, no thanks. Who was she? The next morning, between meetings and phone calls, Alexander found himself scanning the sidewalks as his driver navigated through downtown. It was absurd, he told himself. Chicago wasn't a small town. He wasn't going to stumble upon her again. And yet 3 days later he did. She was sitting on the edge of a fountain in Grant Park, a duffel bag at her feet, eating a sandwich wrapped in paper like it was the first real meal she'd had in days. He told the driver to stop. Izzy saw him approaching before he spoke. "You again," she said, chewing slowly, her tone unreadable. "Me again," he said. He wasn't used to people speaking to him that way, like he was just some guy in the park, instead of the man whose face had been on the cover of Fortune last month. "You never told me your name," she smirked faintly. "Didn't realize you needed it." "I do," he said simply. A beat passed before she said, "Izzy." He nodded. "Alexander, I know," she said, her eyes glinting with something he couldn't read. "Hard to miss your face on half the billboards in this city." He almost smiled. Almost. There was silence then, filled only by the rush of traffic on Michigan Avenue and the distant hum of construction. Finally, he said, "Do you have somewhere to stay?" "I manage," she said too quickly. He studied her, noticing the way she wrapped her arms tighter around herself when the wind picked up. "Come work for me," he said impulsively. Izzy blinked. "Excuse me, I owe you," he said. "I can't just pretend you didn't save my life." "I didn't do it so you'd hire me," she shot back. "I know," he said, "but I'm offering anyway." She looked at him like she was waiting for the punchline. "What would I even do for you?" "Anything you want," he said. "We'll figure it out." For a moment she didn't speak. He saw her pride bristling against something deeper, maybe exhaustion, maybe hunger, maybe the instinct to believe no one offered anything without strings attached. Finally, she shook her head. "I'm not a charity case." "I didn't say you were." Their eyes locked, and for the first time since they met, there was a flicker of something in her expression that wasn't just defiance. Something softer. She stood abruptly, slinging the duffel bag over her shoulder. "I'll think about it," she said, and then she was gone. Swallowed by the river of pedestrians, Alexander stood there for a long time, wondering why it mattered so much to him whether she came back. He didn't know that when she did, it wouldn't be for the reasons either of them expected. Izzy didn't come back the next day, or the day after that. Alexander told himself it didn't matter. He had a company to run, investors to pacify, a merger teetering on the edge of collapse. His world revolved around meetings, headlines, and numbers with too many zeros. He wasn't in the business of waiting for strangers from park benches. But at night, when the city lights stretched endlessly beyond his windows, he caught himself scanning sidewalks from his car, wondering if he'd see her again. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore. There was something about her, the way she looked him in the eye, unafraid, as if she saw straight through the tailored suits and perfect smiles to the man underneath. On the fourth day, she appeared in the lobby of his company's headquarters. The security guard looked ready to throw her out, but Izzy's chin was lifted, her duffel bag slung over one shoulder like she owned the place. When Alexander came down the escalator and saw her standing there, something in his chest loosened. "You said the offer was real," she said when he approached. "It is," he said evenly, though inside he felt strangely relieved. "Fine," she said. "I'll take it. But not because I need saving. I want a chance, that's all." He nodded slowly. "You'll get one." Izzy's first day at Grant Real Estate wasn't glamorous. Alexander set her up as a temporary assistant in one of the lower floors, answering phones, organizing files, running errands. It was far from the corner offices with skyline views, but it was warm, dry, and came with a steady paycheck. The other employees didn't know what to make of her. She wore second-hand clothes and kept to herself, but there was a sharpness in her eyes, a quiet intelligence that made people hesitate before dismissing her. Alexander told himself he wasn't checking on her progress. He just happened to pass through that floor more often than usual, lingering longer than necessary when he saw her typing at the reception desk, brows furrowed in concentration. One afternoon, he overheard two junior managers whispering near the elevators. "She used to be homeless," one said under his breath. "No way," the other muttered. "Why would Grant hire someone like that?" Alexander didn't say a word, but the look he gave them as he passed made both men go pale. Weeks passed. Izzy proved herself quickly, smart, organized, unafraid to speak her mind. The staff who had been skeptical began turning to her for help, and Alexander found excuses to see her more often. But what unsettled him most was the way she treated him. Everyone else in his world either wanted something from him or feared disappointing him. Izzy did neither. She spoke to him like an equal, sometimes even challenging him when she disagreed. And beneath her independence, there was a warmth he hadn't expected, a laugh that slipped out when he least expected it, a softness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. One evening, he offered her a ride home. "Home," she repeated wryly as they stood by his car. "That's a generous word for a rented room with peeling wallpaper. It's still better than the back of a bus station," he said before realizing how blunt that sounded. Her lips twitched. True. The drive was quiet at first, the city lights casting fleeting gold across her face. Then she said softly, "Why did you really hire me?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Because you deserved a chance." "No," she said. "Most people would have given me money and walked away. You didn't." He glanced at her then, just as the streetlight painted her eyes in amber. "Maybe," he said slowly. "I wanted to see what else you could do besides scare off armed men with broken bottles." That made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh that filled the car like music. And Alexander realized, with a jolt he hadn't felt in years, that he didn't want the ride to end. The first time Alexander realized he was in trouble was at the company holiday party. It was held at one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels, a glittering affair filled with crystal chandeliers, a live jazz band, and guests dressed in evening gowns and tuxedos. Alexander attended out of obligation more than desire. These events were for the investors and the board members, people who thrived on champagne, toasts, and small talk he secretly found exhausting. But that night, as he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and offering the practiced smile that had become second nature, his eyes found Izzy near the back of the room. She wore a simple black dress, not designer, not dripping in sequins like the others, but somehow she stole his breath more than anyone else there. Her hair, usually tied back in a nonsense bun, fell loosely over her shoulders, and there was a nervousness in her posture he hadn't seen before. "Didn't think you'd come," he said when he reached her. "I almost didn't," she admitted, "but the free food was too tempting." He smiled, a real one this time, not the kind he gave for cameras. Good enough reason for the first half hour. They stayed on opposite sides of the room. He spoke to investors. She sat quietly at a table with a few assistants she'd grown friendly with, but every time Alexander glanced her way, she seemed to feel it, her eyes flicking toward him before darting back down like she hadn't been, staring to Dot. And then the music changed. The jazz band shifted into a slow, smoky melody, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Alexander didn't think. He crossed the room and held out his hand. Izzy blinked. "Oh no," she said. "I don't dance, neither do I," he said. "But I own the company, so people will just assume I meant to be bad at it." That made her laugh despite herself, and she let him lead her to the floor. It wasn't perfect. He stepped on her foot once. She tripped over his twice, and they both stifled smiles when someone nearby muttered something about the boss and the new girl. But when Alexander's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, when she looked up and met his eyes under the glow of the chandelier, something in the air shifted. The music drowned out the room. She smelled faintly of cheap perfume and rain. The same scent from the night they met, and it shouldn't have undone him the way it did. But it did when the song ended. Neither moved right away. Izzy cleared her throat and stepped back, breaking whatever spell had settled over them. "Thanks for the dance, boss," she said lightly. But her voice was softer than usual. After the party, he offered her a ride again. "No peeling wallpaper tonight," he said when she gave him the address. She smirked faintly, upgrading to cracked ceilings and noisy neighbors. They sat in silence as the car cut through the city, neon signs flashing through the windows. Finally, Izzy said, "People talk, you know, about you and me. Let them," he said. She glanced at him. "It doesn't bother you." "What bothers me," he said slowly, "is how much I don't care what they think." For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the engine. Then she said softly, "This, whatever this is, it can't happen. Why not?" "Because guys like you don't end up with girls like me," she said simply, looking out the window. "Not in the real world." He opened his mouth to argue, but she turned away before he could, her shoulders tense like she was bracing for something she didn't want to feel. That night, Alexander lay awake longer than usual. She was right, in a way. His world and hers were built on opposite foundations: wealth and survival, power and struggle. But for the first time in years, he didn't care about logic or image or the neat order he kept his life in. He just knew he wanted to see her again. What he didn't know was that the world was about to test them both in ways neither of them saw coming. The storm hit on a Thursday, not the kind with rain and thunder, but the kind that arrives with phone calls, headlines, and board members demanding explanations. Alexander had been in back-to-back meetings when his assistant slipped into the room, pale-faced, holding her phone like it was a live grenade. "Sir," she whispered, "you should see this." The article was already spreading online. Anonymous whistleblower accuses Grant Real Estate of fraud in luxury development project. Words like embezzlement and corruption danced across the screen, the kind of words that destroyed reputations before the truth even had a chance to catch up. Within hours, reporters were camped outside the building. Investors demanded answers. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. And in the middle of it all, Izzy walked into his office. "You okay?" she asked softly, shutting the door behind her. He almost laughed. Okay. His company was under siege, his name being dragged across every news channel, and somehow she said it like she actually cared about the man, not the scandal. "I'll survive," he said, though his jaw was tight. She studied him for a long moment. "You didn't do what they're saying, did you?" "No," he said flatly. She nodded once, like she'd already known the answer. Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. Investigators demanded files. Lawyers warned him about public statements. Every time Alexander left the building, cameras flashed in his face, reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. But what surprised him most was Izzy. She didn't treat him like a headline. She didn't flinch when people whispered about him in the hallways. Instead, she brought him coffee when he forgot to eat, dropped off documents when the legal team buried him in paperwork, even snapped at a junior executive who made a joke loud enough for everyone to hear. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, Alexander looked up from his desk to find her standing in the doorway. "You should sleep," she said. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at his features. "I can't. Too much to do." She hesitated, then stepped inside. "You're not alone in this, you know." The words hit harder than he expected. For so long, Alexander had carried everything himself, the company, the expectations, the image of control. No one had ever told him he wasn't alone. He stood slowly, walking toward her. She didn't move. "You have this way," he said quietly, "of showing up when I least expect it. Maybe you needed someone too," she said simply. Their eyes locked, the air between them charged in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. For a moment, it seemed like he might reach for her. But then his phone rang, shattering the moment like glass hitting concrete. By the following week, things had gotten worse. One of the board members, a man named Preston Hale, began circling like a vulture. Preston had always wanted Alexander's position, and the scandal gave him the excuse he needed at a press conference. Preston spoke with carefully measured concern, publicly supporting Alexander while privately rallying the board against him. Alexander saw it happening but couldn't stop it. Not while lawyers and auditors tore through every corner of the company, looking for answers. And through it all, Izzy stayed. She wasn't part of his world, not really, but she anchored him in ways he didn't understand. She asked nothing from him, offered nothing except presence, but sometimes that was the only thing keeping him from breaking. One night, after a particularly brutal meeting, Alexander found her on the rooftop terrace outside his office. The city stretched endlessly below, lights glowing against the dark. Thinking about jumping, she teased softly when he stepped beside her. He huffed out a laugh, low and humorless. "Not tonight." She glanced at him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You'll get through this." He turned toward her then, something unraveling in his chest. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've been through worse," she said simply. The wind tugged at her hair, the city humming beneath them, and Alexander realized she wasn't just talking about herself surviving the streets. She was telling him he could survive this too. It was the first time in weeks he believed it. The investigation stretched into its third week, and the weight of it settled over Alexander like a constant, grinding pressure. Every morning brought new headlines, new speculation, new whispers in the hallways of Grant Real Estate. But beneath the chaos, something else had begun to shift, something between him and Izzy. It started in small ways. She'd bring him coffee before his meetings, always the way he liked it. He'd make sure she got a ride home after late nights at the office. Their conversations grew longer, quieter, drifting into personal things neither of them had shared with anyone else. One night, when the building had emptied and the city outside was swallowed in winter fog, Alexander found her in the break room heating up a cheap cup of instant noodles. "That can't possibly be dinner," he said. Leaning against the doorframe, she shrugged. "It's food." He crossed the room and picked up the paper cup, reading the label. Barely. Izzy smirked. "Not all of us have personal chefs, you know." "Then let me fix that," he said before he realized how it sounded. Her eyebrows lifted. "Are you offering to cook?" "God, no," he said with a laugh. "I'd burn water. But there's a restaurant downstairs. Real food. Come on." She hesitated for only a moment before following him. The restaurant was quiet, half the tables empty this late at night. Alexander ordered steak. Izzy ordered pasta like she was afraid to ask for anything too expensive. "Somewhere between the first and second course," he asked. "Why did you step in that night? With the guys in the alley?" She twirled her fork slowly, eyes fixed on the table. "Because I couldn't just walk by, that's simple." She looked up at him then. "When you live on the streets, you learn two things fast. Nobody's coming to save you, and sometimes you have to be the one who saves someone else, even if you don't know why." Something in her voice hit him harder than he expected. He wondered what it had cost her to become that kind of person, someone brave enough, with a face down a knife with nothing but a broken bottle and sheer will. "You deserved better than what happened to you," he said quietly. She shook her head. "What I deserved doesn't matter. I survived. That's enough." But he could see in her eyes that maybe it wasn't enough anymore. Over the next week, the walls between them kept crumbling. It wasn't the way she laughed at things he didn't realize were funny, the way he caught himself looking for her in every room, the way conversations stretched long past what they should have. And one night, after another brutal meeting with lawyers and auditors, he found her waiting in his office with 2 cups of coffee and that steady, grounding presence he didn't know how to live without anymore. "You should go home," he said, though he didn't want her to. "Maybe I like the view here," she said, nodding toward the city lights outside the windows. He turned toward the skyline, but all he saw was her reflection in the glass. The first snow of the season fell the next evening. Izzy was leaving the building when Alexander caught up to her in the lobby. "Let me give you a ride," he said. She started to refuse but stopped when she saw the snow coming down harder outside. They drove in silence through the glowing streets until she said softly, "You know, this can't work, right?" "What can't this?" "Whatever it is," she said. "People will talk. They already are. Let them." She shook her head, turning toward the window. "You live in a world where everything gets judged. I barely live in it at all. He wanted to argue, but she looked so certain, so braced against something she didn't want to feel, that he stayed silent instead. Still, when she got out of the car, neither of them moved for a long moment. Snowflakes clung to her hair, her coat, the faint curve of her smile before she closed the door and walked away. It was then Alexander realized he wasn't just grateful to her anymore. He wanted her, and not just for tonight, or until the scandal faded. He wanted her in ways that terrified him. But the world wasn't done testing them yet, because the next morning, Preston Hale made his move. Preston Hale had been waiting for the perfect moment, and now he had it. The boardroom was tense when Alexander walked in that morning, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the long mahogany table. Every director was there. Even the usually silent investors who joined by video call looked grim. Preston stood at the head of the table, his smile polite but sharp. "Alexander," he said smoothly, "I think we can all agree this scandal has been difficult for everyone." "Understatement of the year," Alexander muttered. Taking his seat, Preston folded his hands, radiating fake sympathy. "The auditors have cleared you personally, of course. No evidence of wrongdoing on your part." Alexander's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the way Preston said personally, like there was a but coming. "However," Preston continued, "the company's reputation has suffered. Investors are nervous. The press is circling like sharks. It might be time to consider stepping back temporarily for the good of the brand." There it was, the ambush. Alexander felt heat rise in his chest. "You want me out? Just until things settle," Preston said with mock concern. "You'd retain your shares, of course. But the board believes new leadership could reassure the public." "The board," Alexander said slowly, "or you?" Preston didn't answer. He didn't need to. That night, Alexander found himself back on the rooftop terrace, the winter wind cutting across the skyline. He didn't hear Izzy come up behind him until she spoke. "So," she said, "are you going to punch him, or just fire him?" He almost smiled. "Almost. They want me out," he said, voice low. "Hale's been circling for months." This just gave him the excuse he needed. Izzy stepped beside him, her coat wrapped tight against the wind. "What are you going to do?" "I built this company," he said quietly. "Every brick, every deal, every sleepless night. I'm not handing it over to a vulture like him." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then fight. You've survived worse, haven't you?" Something in her voice, steady, certain, hit him hard. He turned toward her, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. "I don't know why you keep showing up," he admitted. "But if you weren't here right now, I think I'd break something." "Maybe I like keeping you from breaking things," she said softly. For a moment, neither moved. The city lights glowed below them, the hum of traffic like a heartbeat in the distance. Then Alexander said, "Come with me. Well, tomorrow's board meeting. I want them to see you there." Her eyes widened. "Because you remind me why I'm fighting," he said simply. And for the first time since the scandal began, Alexander saw doubt flicker in her eyes, not about him, but about herself. The next morning, the meeting exploded before it even began. Preston Hale came armed with votes from 3 board members ready to force Alexander into temporary resignation. The others sat silent, waiting to see who would win. But when Alexander walked in with Izzy at his side, the room shifted. She didn't say a word, just stood near the back, watching with those sharp hazel eyes that missed nothing. Alexander spoke first. "I know some of you think this company needs new leadership," he said, voice calm but carrying through the room. "But what it needs is someone who remembers why we built it in the first place. Not for headlines, not for profits, for the people who believed in it when no one else did." His eyes locked on Preston. "I'm not stepping down. Not now. Not ever. If that means a vote, then let's have one. But understand this. You'll be voting to hand over this company to a man who sees opportunity in disaster. I see something worth fighting for." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut, one by one. The board members shifted, and when the vote came, Preston lost. Barely, but he lost. Afterward, Alexander found Izzy in the hallway. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. "I wanted to," she replied. He studied her. The curve of her shoulders, the way she met his gaze without flinching. "You know you changed everything, right?" Izzy shook her head. "You changed it yourself." "I just showed up," but he didn't believe that for a second. Because somewhere between the rooftop talks, the late-night coffees, and the way she looked at him like he wasn't a headline or a paycheck, Alexander Grant had started falling for her hard. The snow was coming down hard the night Alexander finally let himself breathe. The scandal was over. The auditors had cleared his name publicly. Preston Hale had resigned after a failed coup, his ambitions crushed by the very board members he thought he controlled. Investors were steady again, the company's reputation slowly climbing back from the edge, but none of it felt like victory. Not in the way Alexander expected. Because, through everything, the chaos, the late nights, the fights behind closed doors, what had stayed with him wasn't the company he saved. It was the woman who had walked into his life with nothing but defiance in her eyes and changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Izzy Carter, the woman who stopped 3 armed men with a broken bottle, the woman who refused to be a charity case when he offered her a job, the woman who had stood by him when the world turned its back. And tonight, he couldn't keep pretending he didn't know what she meant to him. She was leaving the office when he found her. The lobby quiet except for the security guard at the desk. "Got a minute?" he asked. Izzy glanced at him, one eyebrow lifting. "That depends. Are you going to offer me another ride or a promotion?" "Neither," he said. "Come with me." She hesitated but followed him outside into the cold. The city glowed around them, steam rising from manhole covers, snowflakes catching in her hair as they walked down the block. He didn't stop until they reached the park, the same park where he'd first seen her sitting on a bench with a paper-wrapped sandwich like it was a five-star meal. "Why here?" she asked softly. "Because this is where it started," he said. They stood under the glow of a street lamp, the snow swirling around them in silver spirals. Alexander turned toward her, hands in his coat pockets, searching for the right words, something he wasn't used to doing. "You walked into my life like you didn't care who I was," he said finally. "Like I was just some guy in trouble. No one's looked at me like that in a long time." Izzy shifted slightly, eyes steady on his. "You were just some guy in trouble." He almost smiled. "Maybe, but you didn't walk away, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he realized how much she carried behind those hazel eyes. Nights on the street, empty rooms, people who made promises and never kept them. "Alexander," she said slowly, "I'm not someone who fits into your world, and maybe," he said softly, "my world needs to change." The words hung between them, warm against the winter air. The kiss, when it finally happened, wasn't the desperate, fiery thing he'd imagined in 100 late-night moments. It was slow, certain, the kind of kiss that felt like a door opening after years of standing in the cold. When they finally pulled apart, Izzy let out a shaky breath. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Yeah," he said, smiling faintly. "But so was you saving my life with a broken bottle." She laughed then, the sound soft but real, like maybe she was finally letting herself believe in something again. Weeks later, the company moved forward stronger than ever, and Alexander found himself dividing his time between boardrooms and a small apartment with cracked ceilings and peeling wallpaper, the place Izzy still insisted on keeping because she said it reminded her where she'd started. She didn't want the penthouse. She didn't want the spotlight. What she wanted was him, and for the first time in years, Alexander realized he wanted something real too, not power, not headlines. Her, always her. On a quiet Sunday morning, with the city spread out below them and the winter sun breaking through the clouds, Alexander told her what had been building since the night she'd stepped between him and a knife without hesitation. "I love you," he said. Simply. Izzy stared at him, like she was trying to decide if the world was playing another trick on her. But then she smiled, small, disbelieving, and perfect. "About time," she said. And for once, Alexander Grant, the man who had built an empire brick by brick, realized he didn't care about the empire at all, because somehow, without even trying, Isabella Carter had built a life with him instead. If you loved Alexander and Izzy's passionate journey, rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments and subscribe for more unforgettable tales of love, desire, and second chances.